talking about kind of the shift, and when you specifically talk about the Beatles, uh, they although they're known for their very creative and innovative sound, certainly in their own right, we also talked about how they very clearly pulled from Chuck Berry, and especially if you go back and look at Chuck Berry's entire musical catalog, not necessarily the hits, it becomes more evident if you just listen to a lot more Chuck Berry and of course Little Richard too. More so, I think that was a little bit more like the Beach Boys. Well, you could hear it a little bit more clearly with the Beach Boys because the Beach Boys are a little bit more straightforward, and of course the Beach Boys were hugely successful as well. But with the Beatles, I think it was more uh, Little Richard's style and presence, and less so the lyrical aspects that you could hear with Chuck Berry, as well as Chuck Berry's overall sound. Chuck Berry had that kind of Western, almost country infused, bluesy rock sound that you can hear on a number of um, blues hits, or not blues hits, Beatles hits that was pretty unique to Chuck Berry. But one of the things about Chuck Berry also was that youthful content. One of the things about rock and roll was how it was really, a lot of it was lyrically designed to appeal more so to the youth than it previously before. And you saw that a little bit in R&B, um, but I think for Chuck Berry and some of these other artists, you can think of it almost as a sort of a black futurist perspective, where people are talking about a you know the hopes and dreams, um, alternative lives, uh, you know the portrayal of the near future or hope for a future for black artists, the black community, a different, more positive outlook, of course, aligning with some of the successes and some of the progresses that we're seeing. And of course, we saw that in the funk era. That was a big component of the funk era, black futurist notions and ideas. Um, but I think when you kind of shifted over to the Beach Boys and what the Beatles were sort of utilizing it for, it becomes a little bit more. It comes a little bit more from a sort of futuristic idealism to more like the more kind of a consumerist, uh, more like more consumerist angles, like kind of the industry kind of injecting and kind of utilizing the terminology and words in the same way to appeal to a youth market, to sort of not only to sell music, but I think there was a lot of as we've seen the industry evolve, we've seen a lot of real intentional marketing integrated with sales and marketing integrated with music, advertising, this and that, commercials. And so I think that's something that maybe we saw a shift from, because obviously there's a huge, we've talked about the cultural sort of contrasts that happen when you just start to pull music from one culture to another. You can appreciate it, especially when it's in the same language. You can appreciate that language, and you can pull it from it and use it as your own, and perhaps why the music was attractive to some of the white audiences, the same reason it they were attracted to the Beatles music as well, because the language, taken at face value, can be seen as the same in a lot of ways, and it can appeal to the youth in the same way. But as we talked about, with some of these black futurist notions and some of these blues and R&B songs and lyrics, they were really talking about some cultural aspects, some history, some history. I mean, some experiences and some, some idealism, futurism, just general fiction. Different types of, just all different types of scenarios and stories that may or may not be pulled from, they may be truth or they may be fiction, but it hits different. It's a little bit different than what we see when you just kind of extract those. It's not really aligned with some of the cultural experiences and history that may have occurred, or where a culture or group of people or an artist wants to go, or wants to hopes that things will go, or for their future generations, or even if it's not real, talking about science fiction, um, it's still attached to some of these experiences and notions that they've personally experienced, or the community or their culture has experienced. And so I think it definitely has a meaning, for speaking about Chuck Berry or some of these artists specifically. The community is hoping that these things are something that they or their children can experience, as far as some of these what were turned into consumerist notions, as far as cars, just summers, beach, vacations, all these sort of fun things that didn't necessarily exist for Black Americans up until from slavery, so hundreds of years, to still for many not yet, but for a lot of people it was in sights, especially when you yourself, as a musician, as a rock and roll icon, you've been kind of thrust into this spotlight, thrust into wealth, and so for you at least, it's realistic. And then once you get there, you can kind of look around and say, if I can do it, why can't you? Which it's definitely more complicated than that, but that's I think that's where it comes from, whereas for these other artists that were coming over from Europe, or were just getting into the rock and roll music and performing it, and just kind of taking that style without the kind of the cultural aspects and whatnot, it just kind of came more commercial and consumerist. I think you can see the same thing with modern hip hop, where you feel like some people are really getting it from they've either lived it or they recognize it in some way or another, and other people are just kind of grasping onto these different terms and words, and maybe taking out of context, or just appreciating the music more at a face value level, which is I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that either, but there sometimes you get into that disconnect. So I guess getting more over to where we actually saw the paths cross for the Beatles and both Little Richard and Fats Domino. So for Little Richard, before the Beatles had really made it as a premier act, while they were touring the UK with Roy Orbison, they got the offer and were able to open for Little Richard in 1962 for 14 shows. I believe it was in Hamburg. And so you can hear them talk or read about various situations where Little Richard or the Beatles will recall Little Richard really helping them, providing them tips. I don't think it's super major. They were both working at the time, obviously, but 14 shows is fairly extensive. And so that was that. And then after, in like 1963, about a year later, the Beatles really started to blow up. And when you listen to early Beatles records, how they got those deals, they really turned more to a more familiar R&B and rock and roll sound, which would be modeled after Little Richard, because at the time, the record labels or people were not really as receptive to the Beatles sound. The industry, at least. I'm sure they had a strong following at that time, and they had already played some original songs that had that distinctive Beatles sound. But as far as the industry's perspective and what they wanted to hear, they really had to go back to a little bit more of a sound that they would have had refined with influence, and maybe also with Little Richard, as just because it was more familiar and that was the sound of the time. And then later, of course, they were able to add their creative spin and sound. Um, and in addition to Little Richard, of course, the Beatles are known for paying heavy respects to Fats Domino. They definitely played songs in his name, and later, eventually, as I talked about when the Fats Domino episode, Fats Domino eventually made a copy or a cover of Lady Madonna, and Fats Domino, Little Richard, and Larry Williams is another one actually, and he was on the same label as Little Richard, and he's not well known, but he benefited really from Little Richard's periodic departures, as we've talked about when we talked about Little Richard, when he departed a couple times from the music scene, and that gave Larry Williams kind of the more of a spotlight and attention to, get his own success as far as his songs. And the Beatles actually covered a number of Larry Williams songs. They covered him actually as it's like tied with someone else. I forget who it is with the most covers as far as how many songs were covered. How many songs of his were covered by the Beatles. And so did the Yardbirds and the Rolling Stones. So Larry Williams is someone who we don't really know about, but a number of major bands that were coming over from Europe covered his songs. And it's one of those kind of bittersweet things that we talked about in the past, because you can't just say that these songs would have been more successful if people hadn't covered them. Maybe we still wouldn't know about them, or maybe wouldn't know about Larry Williams at all, for that matter. But there's the other part where we just continue to see a lot of these artists from Europe really, I think obviously there's no, there weren't bad intentions, especially from the artists, but at the same time, there's clear success built off some level of, at the cost to some level of these other artists.